My name is Skylar Prescott, I am 25 years old. If you have ever sat through an ultimatum that arrived dressed as concern and left you calculating every remaining option in silence, you already know the temperature of what follows. I am not here to perform outrage. I am here to lay out the sequence the way it actually unfolded, cold and exact, so you can decide for yourselves where the line should have been drawn. It began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Madison. I was still at my desk in the downtown office when my phone lit up with a message from my mother-in-law. The wording was precise and final: either I signed the revised family operating agreement by Friday or the compound access codes, the shared accounts, and my place in the household would be revoked. No discussion. No delay. The message ended with the instruction to meet her at the lakeside conference room of the family's property management office that same evening. I closed the laptop, told my supervisor I needed to leave early, and drove north toward the elite suburban compound without calling my husband first. The compound sat on a quiet ridge above Lake Mendota, a cluster of low modern houses connected by private paths and coded gates. I had lived there for 14 months since the wedding. Until that afternoon, I had treated the arrangement as temporary convenience rather than permanent leverage. My mother-in-law was already seated when I walked in. My sister-in-law sat to her right, hands folded, expression carefully neutral. My husband arrived 3 minutes later, still in his work clothes, and took the remaining chair without speaking. The air in the room stayed level. No raised voices. No theatrics. My mother-in-law slid a thin folder across the table. This is the updated agreement. It clarifies decision rights for the compound and the investment accounts. You will sign as the incoming spouse or you will no longer hold residential status here. Blair has already reviewed it and agrees it protects everyone. I opened the folder. The language was dense but clear. Signing would transfer primary control of the compound's operating budget and the linked brokerage accounts to my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law jointly. My husband would retain a secondary signature. I would retain none. The document also contained a clause requiring me to relinquish any claim to future distributions if I ever left the marriage. I looked up. You are asking me to sign away every practical foothold I have in this household. My sister-in-law answered before my mother-in-law could. It is not against you. It is about continuity. You knew the structure when you moved in. Finn and I grew up under these rules. The compound does not run on sentiment. My husband finally spoke. I told them you would understand the practical side. It is only paperwork. I closed the folder. Paperwork that removes my name from every decision and every account while I continue to live under the same roof and contribute to the same expenses. That is not practical. That is extraction. My mother-in-law's voice remained even. You have until Friday at 5. After that the codes change and the accounts freeze for anyone without signature authority. You can stay as a guest with restricted access or you can leave. Those are the only remaining options. I stood. The chair scraped once against the floor. No one else moved. I picked up the folder, walked out, and drove back toward the city without another word. That night I sat at the small desk in the guest suite I still occupied and photographed every page of the agreement. I sent the images to my workplace contact, Noel Kim, with a single line: need a second set of eyes on language. Confidential. Then I waited. The next morning Noel answered before I reached the office. She had already compared the new document against the original prenuptial filing I had once mentioned in passing. 2 clauses had been altered after the wedding date. One alteration quietly redirected a secondary trust distribution stream that had previously listed me as a contingent beneficiary. The second added a non-compete style restriction on any future employment that competed with the family's property management company. Neither change had been disclosed to me. I thanked her, deleted the message thread, and went about the rest of the workday as if nothing had shifted. Inside the compound that evening the atmosphere stayed the same, controlled quiet. My husband asked once whether I had decided. I told him I was still reading. My sister-in-law passed me in the hallway and said, "It is cleaner this way. You will see." My mother-in-law did not appear. On Thursday I requested a formal copy of the notarized original agreement from the estate attorney, Pierce Dalton, using the contact information listed on the family's letterhead. He replied within 2 hours. The scan he attached matched the version I had photographed, including the post-wedding alterations. In the cover note he wrote that the changes had been executed under a power of attorney held by my mother-in-law and witnessed by my sister-in-law. My husband's signature appeared on the acknowledgement page. I stored the file, closed the laptop, and walked the perimeter path of the compound once in the dark. The gates still recognized my code. The lights in the main house stayed on late. No one called after me. Friday morning I went to the office early and drafted a short written response. I did not send it yet. I simply sat with the words on the screen and watched the clock. At 4:57 I transmitted the response to the three of them simultaneously. I would not sign. I would vacate the guest suite by Sunday evening. I expected the access codes to change as stated. The reply from my mother-in-law arrived at 5:01. It contained only 2 sentences. Understood. Codes will update at midnight. Blair will inventory the suite. My husband called 10 minutes later. His voice stayed low and careful. You could have just signed. It would have kept everything simple. I answered that simplicity for them was not the same as safety for me, then ended the call. I packed the same night. Most of what I owned still fit into 2 suitcases and a single box of documents. The rest I left. On Sunday evening I loaded the car, drove through the gate while the code still worked, and watched the rearview mirror until the compound lights disappeared behind the ridge. I spent the first night in a short-term rental near the university. The silence felt exact rather than empty. I opened the scanned agreement again and began marking every clause that had shifted after the wedding. The pattern was consistent. Trust had been offered as shared structure and then rewritten as unilateral control. My sister-in-law's name appeared as witness on every critical page. Monday morning I returned to the office and continued the ordinary work of the week. Noelle asked once whether the documents had clarified anything. I told her they had clarified everything that mattered. She did not press further. By Wednesday the compound codes had changed. My old key fob no longer opened any gate. A brief email from the property manager confirmed that residential status had been revoked and that any remaining personal items would be held for 30 days. I replied that nothing remained. That same afternoon my father-in-law called from the main house. His voice was thinner than I remembered. He asked whether I understood that the agreement had been necessary to keep the accounts stable. I told him I understood the language on the page. He was quiet for several seconds, then said there were things about the original trust that had never been explained to me. He ended the call before I could ask what those things were. I sat with that unfinished sentence for the rest of the day and then carried it into the following week like a sealed envelope I had not yet decided to open. The short-term rental near the university stayed quiet. I kept the scanned agreement on the desktop of my laptop and returned to it only when the ordinary work of the office had ended. Noelle Kim waited until Thursday before she asked for another meeting. We sat in the small conference room after the rest of the floor had cleared. She placed a printed spreadsheet between us and spoke in the same measured tone she used for quarterly reports. The secondary trust distribution stream that had been redirected after the wedding was not an isolated change. Over the previous 18 months a series of smaller transfers had moved funds from accounts that once listed contingent beneficiaries into a new holding entity controlled solely by my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law. The pattern was consistent and quiet. Each transfer stayed below the threshold that would have triggered automatic notification to secondary signatories. My husband's name appeared on the authorization pages, but the initiating requests all originated from the same internal address used by my sister-in-law. I thanked her and asked whether the trail could be reconstructed further without drawing attention. She said it could, provided I stayed patient. I agreed. Patience had already become the only reliable instrument I still held. That evening my father-in-law called again. His voice had thinned further. He asked if I would meet him at the lakeside medical suite the family used for private consultations. I drove north the next morning and found him seated in a quiet room with a view of the water. He did not rise. He simply looked at me for a long moment and then began speaking in short, careful sentences. He said the original trust had been structured differently when I first entered the household. Certain childhood arrangements between my husband and my sister-in-law had never been disclosed to me. Those arrangements included an informal understanding that the compound and its supporting accounts would remain under joint sibling control regardless of marriage. The formal documents had been adjusted after the wedding to match that older private agreement. He had signed the power of attorney under pressure from my mother-in-law while recovering from an earlier procedure. He had not expected the adjustments to reach the level of residential revocation. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked whether the childhood understanding had ever been written down. He shook his head once. It had been spoken only, repeated often enough that both children treated it as fixed. He added that the recent health decline made him want the record corrected, but he no longer controlled the signatures required to reverse the changes. I left the medical suite with the same controlled silence I had carried into it. The information did not surprise me so much as it completed a shape I had already begun to see. Trust had been offered in one form and then enforced in another. The childhood secret had simply provided the private justification. 2 days later my sister-in-law requested a meeting at a neutral downtown office the family sometimes used for external counsel. I arrived on time. She was already seated with a single folder in front of her. The tone remained even. She explained that the inventory of the guest suite had been completed and that certain items had been set aside as joint property under the revised agreement. She listed them without emotion: a set of inherited tableware, 2 pieces of outdoor furniture, and a small brokerage subaccount that had once been earmarked for shared household expenses. She offered to release the personal clothing and documents immediately if I signed a brief acknowledgement that I claimed nothing further. I declined the acknowledgement. She did not argue. She simply noted that the items would remain in storage for the statutory period and then be disposed of according to the operating agreement. The conversation ended there. I walked out into the Madison afternoon and returned to the rental. The following week Noel delivered a second set of findings. The holding entity that now controlled the redirected funds had filed a quiet amendment 3 months earlier. The amendment listed my sister-in-law as managing member and my mother-in-law as sole remaining member with veto authority. My husband's signature appeared again, dated the same week the residential codes were scheduled to change. The financial trail no longer required interpretation. It was a sequence of deliberate steps that began with the childhood understanding, moved through the post-wedding alterations, and ended with the ultimatum I had refused. I stored the new documents alongside the earlier scan. The total picture remained cold and legible. Moral pressure had been applied through private channels: the threat of exclusion, the rewriting of shared language into unilateral control, the use of a trusted sibling relationship to witness and accelerate the process. Each step stayed inside legal form. Each step still produced the same practical result. My husband contacted me once more. The call lasted 4 minutes. He said the family preferred a quiet resolution and that further public discussion would only complicate the accounts. I answered that the accounts were already complicated by the sequence of changes that had never been disclosed. He did not dispute the sequence. He only repeated that the structure had always been intended to protect the compound. I ended the call when the repetition began. Late that same night my father-in-law sent a brief message. The medical suite had scheduled additional consultations. He wanted me to know that the childhood arrangements had included more than property. Certain expectations about loyalty and silence had been enforced long before I arrived. He did not elaborate. The message ended with the single line that he hoped the record could still be set straight while he retained enough clarity to speak. I read the message twice and then closed the phone. The secondary conflict had moved from abstract pattern into concrete admission. Childhood secrets were no longer background. They had become the private mechanism that justified the present coercion. The irreversible consequence was already taking shape in the frozen accounts, the changed codes, and the inventory that treated my former presence as a temporary administrative error. I continued the ordinary work of the office. Noel asked no further questions. The rental stayed quiet. The scanned pages and the new spreadsheets remained the only complete record I held. The pressure from the compound side stayed private and consistent. No public statements. No raised voices. Only the steady closing of every practical door that had once been presented as shared. On the morning of the next scheduled medical consultation, I received a final notice from the property manager. The 30-day holding period for residual items would expire at the end of the following week. After that date, any unclaimed property would be transferred according to the revised operating agreement. The notice was polite and final. I filed it with the rest of the documents and returned to the workday. The shape of the choice had become exact. I could re-enter the structure by signing and accepting the rewritten terms, or I could remain outside it and watch the last administrative threads dissolve. Either path carried a permanent cost. The childhood secret, the financial trail, and the notarized alterations had already removed the possibility of a neutral middle ground. I sat with that clarity through the afternoon and into the evening, the same cold attention I had used from the first ultimatum, waiting for the next required step to declare itself. I waited through the next 2 days with the same controlled attention I had used since the first ultimatum. The medical consultation date arrived without further messages. I drove to the lakeside suite once more and found my father-in-law alone in the same quiet room. His voice was weaker than before, but the words came in a steady sequence. He said the childhood arrangements had included an explicit understanding that any future spouse would remain outside the core decision structure. The understanding had been repeated for years between the siblings and reinforced by my mother-in-law. When the formal documents were adjusted after the wedding, the adjustments simply codified what had already been spoken. He had signed the power of attorney while the recent health decline limited his ability to resist. He now wanted the full record stated while he still could speak clearly. The secondary trust had originally carried a contingent path that included me. That path had been closed deliberately. The redirected funds had not been required for the compound's stability. They had been moved to remove any remaining leverage I might hold. I listened until he finished. Then I asked whether he intended to place any of this in writing. He shook his head once. The signatures required to reverse the changes no longer answered to him. He asked only that I understand the sequence had never been accidental. I thanked him for the clarity and left the suite. The following morning a brief notice arrived from the estate attorney, Pierce Dalton. A quiet internal reallocation within the holding entity had been executed overnight. A portion of the redirected funds had been shifted into a restricted medical reserve under my father-in-law's name alone. The reallocation required no external approval because the operating agreement already granted my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law joint authority. The notice listed the change as administrative. It did not restore any standing to me. It simply moved a slice of the controlled assets into a category that could not be further redirected without additional medical certification. The paperwork had produced a small, silent correction inside the structure that remained closed to me. I filed the notice with the rest of the documents and made no reply. That afternoon my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law requested a final meeting at the same downtown office used earlier. I attended. The tone stayed level. My mother-in-law stated that the residential revocation was complete and that any further contact regarding the compound or the accounts would be directed through the property manager. My sister-in-law added that the inventory period had closed and that the listed joint items had been transferred according to the revised agreement. She offered one last opportunity to sign a general release in exchange for a modest administrative payment. I declined. The meeting ended without raised voices and without any change in the underlying positions. My husband called that evening. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. He said the family considered the matter resolved and preferred that I make no further inquiries. I answered that the inquiries had already produced the complete record and that I required nothing further from the compound. He did not disagree. The call ended. In the days that followed, the practical consequences settled into place. The short-term rental converted to a longer lease. The ordinary work of the office continued. Noel Kim completed the final compilation of the financial trail and then requested that all related files be removed from shared drives. She explained, without elaboration, that continued involvement carried professional risk she could no longer accept. 2 other workplace contacts who had once shared routine lunch conversations grew quieter and then stopped initiating contact. The quiet erasure of those ordinary connections formed the final loss. No dramatic confrontation occurred. The distance simply expanded until the previous ease no longer existed. I did not attempt to reverse the agreements. The signatures and the childhood understanding remained in force. The compound continued under the same joint control. The medical reserve stood as a narrow, quiet adjustment that changed nothing about my standing. I had chosen the exit rather than the signature, and the structure had closed exactly as threatened. The antagonists retained every formal advantage they had designed. What remained was the decision to stop performing the role of the cooperative incoming spouse. I released the last administrative threads, declined every subsequent invitation to revisit the terms, and treated the entire sequence as closed. The guilt that once attached to refusing family expectation dissolved into a simple accounting of cost. Peace required the absence of pretense. I accepted the absence. The unsettled feeling did not disappear. It settled beside the clearer knowledge that I had refused the moral trap that demanded my signature in exchange for continued access. The trap had been built from private coercion, rewritten documents, and a childhood secret treated as permanent law. I walked out of it with less than I entered, yet with the record intact and the performance ended. Thank you for listening to my story. What is your breaking point when the people who claim to protect the family structure rewrite the rules until your presence becomes an administrative error?